is my slide that I'm not supposed to show, since I was supposed to make only 7 slides. So this is the 8th slide. So I will immediately go to the first slide. So what this theory is about that Shima and I will be presenting. I will be presenting, let's say, the conceptual framework. Shima will more speak about some of the implications and applications. It's a theory that's supposed to answer the so-called hard problem of consciousness. And that hard problem is about the nature of what is called subjective experience. So the term subjective experience is the one I most like. Some call it phenomenal experience, some call it qualia. But I think subjective experience best captures what it is about, and which I would define as the feeling that accompanies a conscious perception or thought. So whenever you have something that you're conscious of, there is some kind of a subjective feeling that accompanies that. It's not just an objective piece of knowledge. So the hard problem of consciousness is then what precisely constitutes such a subjective experience, and also why do we have them? What is the function of these subjective experiences? And this particular question is elicited by a famous thought experiment proposed by David Chalmers, a philosopher, who imagines that there could be a zombie, where a zombie, a so-called philosophical zombie, is a creature that looks exactly the same like a human being, that behaves exactly the same like a human being, but that does not have subjective experience. And Chalmers, from this thought experiment, concludes that if science cannot distinguish between a zombie and a normal human being, then by definition, science will never be able to explain this subjective experience. And that means that subjective experience is something that you could do without, since conceivably there are zombies that don't have it. So then the conclusion is subjective experience, not only we can't explain it, but it is what some have called an epiphenomenon, something that just happens to accompany consciousness, but that does not in se have any function. So that is what I definitely do not agree with. So the theory that Shima and I have been developing is an answer to that, and to speak about the actual function of subjective experience. How do I change? So first question typically asked about subjective experience, why is it subjective? To me, as a cybernetician, that's kind of a silly question, because as a cybernetician, I see humans as autopoietic systems. That means systems that are producing themselves and that interact with the world from this autonomous autopoietic point of view. So there is no way in which you could objectively perceive the world. What is the world for an autopoietic system? That is whatever affects the inner working of the autopoietic system. That means the processes going on inside my own organism. If these processes are affected by something, then that I can sense. If they don't affect me, I don't care, I can't see them, I don't perceive them, they don't exist. So by definition, experience is something that the self, the subject senses. But here I want to make a distinction between positive affection and negative affect. Something could be seen as a positive effect if it potentially could help my autopoiesis. So an autopoietic system wants to continue producing itself, it wants to survive. So anything that helps it is, you might say, a positive effect. Anything that disturbs it, that means that potentially endangers autopoiesis, is a negative effect. So from this point of view, all subjective experience happens not necessarily from the internal, the so-called first-person perspective, something I see from inside my own organism. And it is, of course, colored by what for me personally, for my organism, is of value. That means things that for me are valuable may not be valuable for some other thing. So it is colored by value. So now we look at this function of affect. So I say that something affects me. That means that my organism in some way senses it. What is this effect? Well, the organism has its own dynamics of processes. An effect means that some force, which I might also call a drive or a tension, acts on these processes. It pushes them in some different direction than they would have gone on their own. So an effect for me is something like a force which pushes or pulls, pushing towards things that are better for autopoiesis, positive configurations, which we may interpret as resources or opportunities, while it pushes away from negative configurations. That means configurations that would somehow endanger autopoiesis, things that I may call dangers or disturbances. Now, this idea of pushing or pulling, we can very easily visualize it if we imagine a bacterium. We know that bacterium can swim up gradients. They sense the changes in the concentration of certain chemicals, and they can in that way sense gradients, and they will typically move towards food. That means a positive configuration that attracts them, and they will move away from toxins. That means a negative configuration that repels them. Now, of course, you might say bacteria can sense their surroundings, they can sense the presence of food or of toxin, but of course they are not conscious. So to have a theory of consciousness, I need to add one more aspect next to this aspect of force or drive, and that is the aspect of freedom, actually. So if we look at consciousness in a very practical sense, we notice that most of the processes in the human brain are subconscious. That means they happen automatically, involuntarily, immediately in the background. Some light falls on my retina, that these pixels of light on my retina are translated by my brain into an image that I recognize, and I recognize, for example, that there is a cat there, or there is a cup there, or there is a person there. It's a very complex process. Neural networks have by now learned to do the same thing, but these neural networks are very complicated, and they use a mode of what is called feed-forward propagation. Sensors get activated, and through a number of modules of specialized brain circuits, of specialized layers of neural networks, that is eventually turned into some interpretation or potentially in an action. That's a subconscious process. So what's the difference between a conscious process? A conscious process is one where I can somehow intervene in the process. That means I can examine the content of my mind. I can recall it, I can monitor it, I can, if necessary, redirect it. That means that if I seize, for example, a cat, the fact of recognizing the cat, that's a subconscious process, I can't control that. But once I have recognized the cat, then I can start thinking about what does that mean? Why is there a cat? Is that the cat of the neighbors? Is that a lost cat? What should I do? Should I pick up the cat? Should I call the neighbors? Now I have possibility to intervene. I have a chance to interact with that content of consciousness. Now, the theory which, in my view, best explains that at the level of the brain is a so-called global neuronal workspace theory of consciousness, and I have depicted it as my own picture of how I interpret it. Information comes in via a sensor. This information then starts circulating in the so-called global workspace. The global workspace is considered as a kind of a network within the brain that interconnects different, more specialized parts of the brain. And while circulating, it stabilizes itself to some degree. The circulation has sometimes called reverberation, re-entry, recurrence, or the term which I think is maybe most appropriate, resonance. Resonance means that you have a kind of a cyclical activation. Neurons that pass on their activation to other neurons. Neurons cannot remain activated on their own. They always must pass on that activation. But if the activation circulates, that means it goes back and forth between a whole group of neurons, then I have something that kind of can be maintained. And while it is maintained, it can now interact with other parts of the brain that are not conscious, parts of the brain that here are called modules. And these can either add things to the circulating pattern or get information from the circulating pattern. So for me, this is a model of free will in the sense that decisions are made in the global workspace. There isn't a single part of the brain that is deciding what needs to do. The global workspace functions at what has been called a forum, a meeting ground where the different modules of the brain can converse and, like a society of mind, collectively decide what needs to be done. So now I have these two elements. I said, first element, experience, is affect. Affect is a kind of a force or drive. Second element, consciousness, means there is a freedom, there is a range of possibilities. If I put the two together, the forces and the idea of the free choice or the range of potentials, then I come to what I call a field. So why a field? A force typically is represented in physics as a vector. A force is something that tells the organism in what way it might want to move away from bad things towards good things. So it's a kind of a drive. But I also assume that there is a freedom. That means there is not one deterministic answer. There is a range of possibilities. That is why it can be presented as a field. You have a kind of a space of potential actions, and by actions I mean both physical actions and cognitive actions, like thinking, predicting, evaluating. The cognitive actions that I could perform with the present content of my consciousness, there is a range of these actions. And for each of these actions, there is a vector associated which corresponds to the force in the sense of some direction of what may be suggested to be done. And I imagine this as a kind of a local field. That means it starts from the present content of consciousness and it creates a prospect of things that are more or less likely to happen, are more or less important to happen. That's a little bit the picture. It's rather clumsily made, but the picture shows the arrows, which are the forces going in different directions, and the fact that there is more than one direction, and that as you go further away from the focus, the field becomes weaker, the field intensity diminishes, things become more fuzzy, become more uncertain. One more element of the local field theory is that a field is something that has dimensions. So if you imagine a vector, you could look at dimensions. Now, in the brain is a highly multidimensional system. So I'm not going to say that I can speak about all the dimensions of this field, but there are at least some features that I think are so basic that they need to be there, and by including these features as basic dimensions, I think I can already capture lots of the things that intuitively we associate with this consciousness. So I'm conscious of something, for example, I'm conscious that there is a cat in a bush. Some of the dimensions of that consciousness are the most important one is values. Good or bad, what do I want, what do I avoid? Affordances, what could I do? Predictions, what can I expect in this situation? What is the range of things that might happen once I see a cat under a bush? Features, what is it exactly? What kind of a cat is it? Is it the cat of the neighbors? Causes, why is that cat there? Where does it come from? What's its origin? And perception, how can I find out more? I know something about it. Maybe I need to find out more. these 6 dimensions I call together the prospect. The prospect is this range of outcomes, that means next steps that I, to some degree, expect, to some degree, desire. I don't really want to distinguish between expectation and desire, because expectation and desire both are dimensions within this field, but the field is pointing towards things that are more or less likely to happen next. Finally, this is a conceptual model, the local field. I need to be very clear about that, because the term field has been used a lot in consciousness studies as a physical field. We have all these kind of new age theories that imagine that there is some kind of a global quantum field that pervades the universe and of which our consciousness is just a little bit. That is not what I'm speaking about. I'm not speaking about some physical field. I'm speaking about a conceptual model which could potentially become a mathematical model, and being a mathematical model, it could also potentially become a computer model. That means potentially this theory could lead to a simulation. Potentially it could even lead to an artificial intelligence program that has some degree of subjective experience. So what is the function of that model? It is to make a bridge between, on the one hand, our actual subjective experience. That means the things we really feel when we are experiencing things, where we feel things like balance, like uncertainty, like mystery, like affordances, and the more traditional approach to consciousness theory, which are the neural correlates. The neural correlates means the patterns of activation in different parts of the brain that tend to go with certain conscious experiences. So what would I consider as a kind of a generic neural correlate of this local field? This is a concept that comes from the consciousness theory of Stephen Grossberg. He calls it an adaptive resonance. I already spoke about a resonance as some kind of a pattern that is self-maintaining within the brain, that is circulating in a kind of a circular or bootstrapping way, so that it's maintaining itself. But while maintaining itself, it's also adapting. It's also adapting to new inputs, and that adaptation happens mostly in a continuous way, but occasionally the resonance can move into a new attractor which is a little bit like collapsing a fuzzy pattern of activation into a more focused one, a new resonance. So the mathematical model to describe it is not yet ready, but I see it visually as this kind of a self-maintaining pattern of activation that, under the influence of inputs from the different modules, start shifting and then reaches a new attractor, and then from there it again starts shifting, and we have this very complex process with, of course, the brain is highly nonlinear. There are lots of different inputs and outputs. We can't expect that a model like this would ever capture the whole of what goes on in the brain, but I think qualitatively this kind of model explains what I would say are the important aspects of consciousness. So that is the end of my presentation, and unless there are immediate questions, I suggest to continue with one of